Okay, so here we are back with the fourth part of the unwrapping video, and where I left off previously was I created this simple scribbly texture to show you as an example um, how it actually shows up in 3ds Max. And if I open up Photoshop here, you'll see I reverted it back to its original wireframe here. Now the way I like to work is, you'll notice the wireframe in this is purple with black showing the inside or the edges of the polygons. And that's well and good, but when you do go back to 3ds Max, you want to make sure that, as you can see here, parts of that purple is actually visible on the texture. So I'll go ahead back to Photoshop here, and I'll just go ahead and save this PSD back and bring up 3ds Max again and reload this texture. As you see, it automatically vanished, but you can now see the actual lines from the wireframe. Now, one way we can avoid that is, while we're in Photoshop, we can actually just turn off the background, and I'll save that Photoshop file, go back to 3ds Max, and it saved it. And what I will show you to do in Photoshop is to uh, kind of a combination of 3ds Max and Photoshop working together, because whether you're working in film or games or even civil developing cityscapes or whatever it may be, you tend to always have Photoshop open also. So I'll go ahead and bring Photoshop back up. I'll turn on my background so I can see my wire. And I've already got a wood texture that I'm going to use. And you can find a wood texture anywhere. You can even go on Google and just type in wood texture and find many different kinds. But the specific one I'm going to be working with I chose for a reason, and when I open it up I'll explain why. The wood texture I chose is a simple wood grain. Now traditionally I would if I were to use something like this, I would not pick anything that had like nails in it, hinges, burn marks, scratches, because the cleaner the wood, the easier it is to manipulate and later on add by painting or doing more image manipulation, add wood, hinges myself. So I tend to start with a very clean piece of wood or texture or metal or whatever it may be as possible. So in this case, as I discussed in class, we tend to keep our um, textures square, perfectly square by the power of 2, 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048. And in this case, if I go up here to image mode, let's see, image size, and open this, you'll notice that it is 2487 by 1500 pixels high. And that's all well and good, except for the fact that it's not squared. And later on, whether or not you're exporting to video games, for those of you who want to work in games, you need to have these things perfectly squared. But if we do that now, you'll notice if I changed it, by default you'll see it as this. I'm just going to change it to a 1024 map. But you'll notice that the height did not change. So I could go, well, I'll just type it down here. Doesn't work. The top of it changed. But there is this thing called Constrain Proportions in Photoshop that if you uncheck this box and now type it in 1024 by 1024, it keeps those dimensions. So you'll notice it did make it 100% square. And I didn't necessarily have to do 1024. It's just a texture size that I tend to use for basic textures, especially for this example. Now there's also one thing about this, is there are some impurities within this image, as you can tell right here. And that is things like there's a line going through it, I've got some wood grain up here, and not to mention that if I were to tile this, that means take this one image and spread it over a large area, you'd be able to see the boundaries of where the tiles and the wood grains and everything does not match up. And the way we change that is with certain filters called offset, and we do that. But for the intensive purposes of this tutorial, I'm not going to go that far into it. We will be getting on with that later on in the semester, but at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and use the image as it is. And another reason why I made it 1024, because if you do remember back in 3ds Max when we rendered out this template, it was 1024 by 1024. So if I open up the pixel dimensions on this, it is 1024 by 1024 also. And the same with this one. So now I'm just going to pull this wood texture onto this, and now that it's on my wireframe, I can go ahead and close my original texture. But I am going to save it. So let me scroll out here in Photoshop, and you'll notice it'll fit exactly right inside there. Now, if you have a hard time lining up, your image that you've, whatever it may be, inside Photoshop, there's a simple way to actually make it clip and snap into the corners, and that is if you click on View at the top, there's a thing called Snap, and if it's turned off, you'll notice you can actually bypass the edges or the tops of the bottoms or whatever it may be. But with Snap enabled, you can then click it right to fit your image. And once that's done, I'll just hit enter. Now, if I were to go ahead and save this Photoshop file by hitting Control S to save, and then switching back to 3ds Max, you'll notice that the image, or excuse me, the box actually went ahead and fit right on here. Now you'll notice the wood grain does not line up, and that's perfectly fine. That covers some more tutorials we'll be doing later on in the semester. The idea now is to actually just put a texture on it. And I'm going to click the render production up here so you can actually see there's our box in a render. Because the purpose of this is to just actually show how to put a texture on an image and then explain how it is sitting on that image. And there are other things we can do to get the wood grains to fit perfectly, as I said, for later on in the semester. But you notice my background layer is still the wireframe. Yours may look like this, and that's fine. But I hit Control I to invert it because I like working on a whiter background, just so if I have to lower the opacity or whatever, I don't have like a basic gray. And I'll show you what I mean. So let me just double click on this to unlock this bottom layer. I tend to not like it looking like this, but if it's white, I can see the lines better. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and create a new, or a copy of layer 0. Actually, I won't do that. I'll just turn off the wood texture, and I'll add a new layer above the wood texture. And I will zoom in just a little bit. And I'm just going to click a simple brush, a square brush. Let's see what size I can pick. I grouped it on accident. That's my fault. Create a new layer. And so I can just have this brush to make these little dots. Again, I can save that, go back to 3ds Max and see what it did. There's the dot. And it does update instantly, which is very convenient. Back to Photoshop. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create different layers, 6 layers, starting off with, as it says, layer number 3. I tend to usually name my layers, but for the intents and purposes of this tutorial, I'll just go ahead and just keep adding layers. But I want to make them as different colors. This one, first one, I'll just go ahead and make red. Hold down my bracket button to make the brush a little bigger, and I'll click. Then I'll choose another color. Let's pick like blue. There we go. I'll go for green. Yellow. Looks kind of like a circus tent, don't you think? Let's go ahead and go orange. And let's go ahead and do black. And I'll turn the wood texture back on. I'll hit Control S to save that and go back to 3ds Max. And it updated automatically. Now you're able to actually see each one of those spheres on their corresponding mesh or spot or location on the mesh, and you can see how it turns out here without any issues. And that's about the area where I want you to get to, because while you were going to do this in class today, and I apologize again for not being able to come in, but I am able to provide you with this tutorial, which is an expansion on last week's thing that we went over in class. I usually said I didn't do a video for this, but there were a lot of questions asked specifically, and I hope I addressed them all here. But in class, once everybody has done this, hopefully starting on Wednesday, you're going to have to do this on your own, but not with a simple cube. You'll be doing it with another simple object, either it be a cylinder or whatever it may be, just so I know you understand the basics of unwrapping. I know for the first 3 weeks we talked about using 3D space, and now we're back into flat space and how it corresponds into 3D space, and it's a little more difficult for some people to understand. But hopefully these videos did help a little bit. I'm sure they did. And that's about it for this one. We will continue on with this more with creating custom textures in either Photoshop or in 3ds Max through procedural, like the glass tutorial I did in school that day. And thank you very much.